In the sterile break room of Vireon Systems, a communications specialist was about to discover that some battles require more than documentation. What started as a routine morning coffee run took a shocking turn when they came face to face with systematic corporate corruption. Maya Ortiz wasn't your typical tech employee. For 4 years, she had spent her life climbing from temp to communications lead, known for her meticulous attention to detail and quiet determination to do the right thing. When she encountered HR Director Simon Trask dismissing her harassment complaint as miscommunication, she had no idea she was walking into a web of evidence destruction spanning multiple companies. Maya's decision to secretly document everything would lead to a federal investigation that would reshape workplace protections across America. What began as one woman's struggle against inappropriate behavior would become a landmark case exposing how corporations systematically erase harassment complaints. The tech industry would never be the same after Maya's refusal to disappear quietly brought down a network of executives who specialized in silencing victims. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee maker in the break room had been broken for 3 weeks, and no one bothered to fix it. Maya Ortiz stood there at 7:43 a.m., staring at the out-of-order sign taped to the chrome surface like it held answers. She didn't have Vireon Systems prided itself on innovation, cutting-edge tech solutions for Fortune 500 clients, but couldn't manage to replace a $60 coffee maker. Typical, she thought, grabbing her thermal mug and heading back to her desk on the 14th floor, where the internal communications team lived in a cluster of gray cubicles that smelled like dry erase markers and someone's leftover Thai food. Maya had been at Vireon for 4 years, climbing from temp to full-time communications lead, the kind of slow, steady ascent that her parents had dreamed of when they'd scraped together money for her college tuition. Her father still called it the good job, one with benefits and a steady paycheck, the one that meant she'd made it. But lately the good job felt like walking through quicksand. Every meeting, every email, every casual conversation carried undercurrents. She couldn't quite name it, started small, the way these things always do. Elliot Rains, Sr., Vice President of Marketing, had begun lingering by her desk more often than necessary. He'd lean against the partition wall close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, something that probably cost more than her monthly Metro pass, and he'd ask about her weekend plans, or comment on her outfit. Nothing overtly inappropriate. Just enough to make her skin crawl in a way she couldn't articulate. The first real incident happened during a strategy meeting for the Q3 product launch. Maya had prepared a presentation on internal messaging strategy, 15 slides of carefully researched data about employee engagement metrics and communication touchpoints. She'd spent 3 days perfecting it, and when she stood to present, Elliot interrupted her before she reached the second slide. "Maya, those numbers look interesting, but let me ask you something," he said, leaning back in his chair with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "What's your gut feeling about this campaign? Not the data, your instincts." As a woman in this demographic, she'd paused, uncertain whether to feel flattered or insulted. The other 7 people in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything. Finished her presentation in half the time she'd planned, skipping slides and rushing through conclusions that deserved careful explanation afterward. As everyone filed out, Elliot approached her. "You know, Maya, you're really talented," he said, standing too close again, "but sometimes you come across as a little too analytical for this industry. You might want to work on being more intuitive, more natural." She'd smiled and nodded, because that's what you did when a senior executive offered feedback, even when it felt like sandpaper on an open wound. But that night she'd gone home and opened a new document on her laptop, typing the date and time, and Elliot's exact words. She told herself it was just documentation, not evidence, just keeping track. The second incident came 2 weeks later during the company happy hour at the rooftop bar downtown. Maya rarely attended these events, but Ria Desai from her team had convinced her to come out for once, to be social, to network like everyone else did. Elliot had been holding court near the windows, telling stories about his days at his previous company, when he'd spotted Maya, Across the room, "Maya, there you are," he'd called out loud enough for half the bar to come over here. "I was just telling everyone about the time I saved a $20 million client relationship with nothing but charm and a bottle of champagne." She'd approached reluctantly, and he'd immediately put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into the circle of listeners. She'd felt herself tense up but didn't want to make a scene in front of colleagues. "This one here," he'd said, gesturing to Maya with his drink. "She's got potential, but she's wound tighter than a Swiss watch. I keep telling her to loosen up, have some fun, but she's all business all the time. Aren't you, Maya?" The Gru had laughed awkwardly, and Maya had excused herself to the bathroom where she'd spent 10 minutes staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering if she was overreacting. If this was just Elliot being Elliot, the friendly mentor who meant well but had poor boundaries. But when she'd returned to the group, she'd overheard him talking to 2 other marketing executives. "Maya's got this uptight thing going on," he was saying, "but I think I can crack that shell. She just needs the right kind of attention. You know what I mean." She'd left the party without saying goodbye and spent the weekend second-guessing herself. Maybe she was being too sensitive. Maybe this was just office culture. Maybe she needed to develop thicker skin. But on Monday morning she'd added the incident to her document with timestamps and witness names. The pattern continued for weeks. Elliot would find reasons to stop by her desk during lunch breaks. When the office was quiet, he'd comment on her hair or her clothes, always followed by that same smile that made her feel like she was being catalogued. He'd assign her to projects that required late-night collaboration sessions, just the 2 of them in conference rooms with glass walls that might as well have been invisible. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Maya had been working on a comprehensive communications audit for 6 months, analyzing every touchpoint between Vireon and its employees, from onboarding materials to exit interviews. It was solid work, the kind of strategic thinking that could reshape company culture. But when she'd presented her findings to the executive team, Elliot had dismissed them before she'd finished. "Maya, Maya," he'd said, shaking his head with that condescending smile. "We appreciate the effort, but this feels like academic theory, not real-world application. Maybe you should stick to what you know best, the day-to-day communication stuff. Leave the big picture strategy to those of us with more experience." The room had gone quiet. Other executives had studied their phones or the ceiling anywhere but Maya's face. She'd felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from something deeper, something that tasted like injustice. She'd spent months on that audit, months of research and analysis, and interviews with employees at every level of the company, and Elliot had dismissed it in 30 seconds. Afterward, Rhea had found her in the supply closet where Maya had gone to collect herself. "That was bullshit," Rhea had said, bluntly, "complete and total bullshit. Your audit was brilliant and everyone in that room knew it." Maya had looked at her friend, this woman who said what she thought with calculation, and felt something shift inside her chest. "Rhea, can I ask you something?" she'd said. "Do you think Elliot has a problem with boundaries?" Rhea had stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Maya, honey, Elliot doesn't have boundary problems. He has a pattern. There's a reason. 3 women from marketing have transferred to other departments in the past 2 years, and it's not because they wanted career changes." That night Maya had sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her growing document and realized she wasn't documenting incidents anymore. She was building a case. She just hadn't decided what to do with it. Yet the email to HR went out at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Maya had rewritten it 17 times, trying to strike the right tone, professional but clear, specific but not emotional. She'd included dates, times, witnesses, and a summary of documented incidents. She'd even attached screenshots of the inappropriate messages Elliot had sent to her work chat, messages he'd thought were private. But Maya had learned to screenshot everything. The auto reply came back immediately. "Thank you for contacting Vireon Systems Human Resources. Your inquiry is important to us and will be reviewed within 48 hours. For urgent matters, please contact the Employee Assistance Program." Maya had stared at the corporate boilerplate and felt her stomach drop. This wasn't urgent. It was just her career, her dignity, her right to work without being treated like a conquest. Simon Trask called her that afternoon, his voice warm and professional, the kind of tone that made you feel like you were talking to a therapist or a funeral director. "Maya, thanks for reaching out. I've reviewed your email and I'd like to schedule some time to discuss your concerns. Could you stop by my office tomorrow around 2? His office was on the 16th floor, executive territory with real walls instead of cubicle partitions and windows that actually opened. Simon was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s with the kind of MBA polish that came from good schools and better networking. He'd offered her coffee from a machine that actually worked and settled behind his desk with a yellow legal pad and a sympathetic expression. So Maya, he'd said, clicking his pen, why don't you tell me what's been going on? She'd walked through everything again, speaking slowly and clearly, the inappropriate comments, the bound violations, the professional undermining, the pattern of behavior that had escalated over months. Simon had nodded and taken notes, occasionally asking for clarification or specific dates. He'd seemed genuinely concerned, engaged, invested in understanding her experience. When she'd finished, he'd set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Maya, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I really do, and I want you to know that we take all concerns seriously, but I have to ask, have you considered that there might be some miscommunication here? Miscommunication, she'd repeated the word, felt foreign in her mouth. Elliot is certainly enthusiastic, Simon had continued, and sometimes enthusiasm can be misinterpreted as something else, especially in a mentoring relationship. Have you considered that his interest in your career might be coming from a place of genuine support? Maya had felt something cold settle in her chest. Genuine support doesn't include comments about cracking shells or needing the right kind of attention. Simon had smiled, that practiced HR smile that meant nothing and everything. Maya, I think you might be reading more into casual conversations than was intended. Elliot speaks highly of you. He's mentioned several times that he thinks you have real potential, but perhaps there's been some miscommunication about boundaries. He'd used that word again, miscommunication, like it was a magic spell that could erase weeks of documented harassment. Maya had pulled out her phone, opened the screenshot folder. I have messages, she'd said. These aren't miscommunications, they're inappropriate communications sent to my work chat. After hours, Simon had glanced at the phone but hadn't taken it to look closer. Maya, I understand you feel uncomfortable, but workplace communication can be tricky to interpret. Context matters, tone matters, and sometimes messages can seem different than they were intended. He'd reached for a folder on his desk and pulled out a form. What I'd like to do is document this conversation and then have an informal mediation session with you and Elliot, clear the air, address any misunderstandings and establish some guidelines going forward. How does that sound? Maya had stared at the form. It was titled Employee Concern Resolution Informal Process. At the bottom in small print, it stated that filing this form constituted agreement to resolve the matter through internal mediation, and waived the right to external filing. I'd like some time to think about this, she'd said. Of course, Simon had replied, but Maya, I hope you'll consider that Elliot is a valued member of our executive team, and these kinds of allegations can be very damaging to someone's career. We want to make sure we're being fair to everyone involved. Walking back to her desk, Maya had felt like she was moving through water. Everything seemed distorted, harder to navigate. She'd sat in her cubicle and stared at the form for 20 minutes before folding it and putting it in her desk drawer. The changes started small. Elliot stopped coming by her desk, but she noticed him watching her from across the office, his expression unreadable. The friendly morning greetings from other marketing executives dried up, replaced by polite nods and averted eyes. Maya began to feel like she was wearing a sign that only she couldn't see. Then came the meeting. She wasn't invited to the Q4 planning session that she'd helped organize for the past 2 years. Her calendar showed her as busy during that time block, but she hadn't scheduled anything. She'd called IT and been told there was no record of any calendar modifications. Rhea had found her after the meeting, looking shell-shocked. They restructured the entire internal communication strategy, she'd said. And you weren't even in the room, Maya. They made decisions about your projects, your budget, your team, and you weren't there. Who was there? Maya had asked, though she already knew the answer. Elliot led the whole thing, there too, taking notes that night. Maya had gone home and pulled up her work laptop. She'd tried to access the shared drive where she'd stored her harassment documentation, but got an error message. Access denied. Please contact your system administrator. She'd tried again. Thinking it was a glitch, the message persisted. Her screenshots were still on her personal phone, but the folder she'd created in her work documents had vanished, along with the email drafts she'd saved and the notes she'd taken during her meeting with Simon. It was as if the conversation had never happened. Maya had sat on her couch staring at her phone screen, feeling something that was bigger than anger and smaller than despair. They weren't just dismissing her complaint, they were erasing it, making it disappear as if her experience didn't matter. As if she didn't matter. But Maya Ortiz had learned something important from her parents, who'd built a life from nothing in a country that didn't always welcome them. She'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to be smarter than the system that wanted to crush you. She'd opened her laptop and created a new folder on her personal cloud storage, and began uploading everything. The text message came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, just 3 words. Can you talk? Maya stared at her phone screen, recognizing Theo Jenkins' number. He worked in IT systems administration. The quiet guy who kept the servers running and the data flowing. She'd helped him avoid a layoff 2 years ago, when budget cuts had targeted his department, and he'd never forgotten she'd called him back immediately. Theo, it's Maya. What's going on? Maya? His voice was careful, measured. I was running some routine maintenance on the backup servers tonight, and I noticed something odd. Some of your files in the shared drive, they have deletion timestamps, but the logs show they were removed manually, not automatically. Her pulse quickened. Can you tell who deleted them? There was a pause that felt like an eternity officially. No, the admin logs are restricted, but Maya, these weren't system deletions with elevated access. Went in and specifically targeted your documents. They met the next morning at a coffee shop, 6 blocks from the office. Theo looked nervous, constantly checking his phone and glancing at the door. Maya had brought her laptop and a notebook. He'd brought a USB drive, and what looked like a panic attack. I could lose my job for this, he said, but what I found, it's not right. He'd plugged the USB drive into her laptop and opened a folder labeled Recovery Logs. When files get deleted from our system, they don't actually disappear right away, he explained. They get moved to a secure backup partition for 90 days, in case of accidental deletion, but someone has been accessing that partition and permanently deleting files. Maya felt her hands shake as she scrolled through the data. Her harassment documentation, her email drafts, her meeting notes. With Simon, all of it gone, had recovered the deletion logs. Look at this, he said, pointing to a timestamp. Your files were deleted at 2:17 a.m. 3 days ago, and here's the access log. Simon Trask, HR Director, logged in at 2:14 a.m. from his home IP address. She stared at the screen, absorbing the implications. Simon hadn't just dismissed her complaint. He'd actively destroyed the evidence. There's more, Theo said. He'd opened another folder, this one labeled Slack Exports. I pulled the chat logs from your conversations with Elliot, the ones you mentioned. Some of these messages don't appear in the current system, but they're still in the backup archives. Maya watched as Theo reconstructed conversations that had vanished from her work. Chat Elliot's late-night messages, his inappropriate comments, his veiled threats when she'd started pulling away from his attention, all of it preserved in digital amber. How did you know? Look for this, she asked honestly. I've been suspicious for months. Theo admitted there have been several unusual admin actions, late-night deletions, access logs that don't match standard procedures, and your name kept appearing in the deletion logs. He'd handed her a printout of the admin activity report. Maya's files weren't the only ones that had been purged. 3 other female employees had similar patterns of document deletion, all handled by Simon, all occurring late at night, all permanent. Maya felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about a system. designed to erase women who spoke up to make their experiences disappear, as if they'd never happened. Can you make copies of everything, she asked. Theo nodded, already burning another USB drive. But Maya, you need to be careful. Simon has administrative access to everything, your email, your files, calendar. If he knows you're collecting evidence, he can make it all disappear. She'd left the coffee shop with 2 USB drives, and a growing sense that she wasn't fighting Elliot anymore. She was fighting something much bigger, much more insidious than one man's inappropriate behavior. She was fighting an infrastructure of silence. That afternoon, she'd set up a personal email account and began forwarding copies of everything to herself. Every document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence. She'd created a digital paper trail that existed outside Vireon's reach. But she'd also realized something else. She couldn't fight this alone. She needed an ally. Someone inside the company who understood the legal implications of what Simon was doing. Someone who could flag this through proper channels before it disappeared entirely. She'd remembered the diversity town hall from last month, where a young woman from legal had spoken about workplace equity and ethical compliance. Nina Bay, junior counsel, newly hired from a public interest law firm. Maya had paid attention then because Nina had spoken with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested personal experience with injustice. Maya had found Nina's sound email in the company directory and composed a message that was careful and professional but desperate around the edges. Nina, I attended the diversity town hall last month and was impressed by your presentation about workplace equity. I'm currently dealing with a situation that may have legal implications, and I'd appreciate your perspective. Could we schedule a brief conversation? She'd sent the message at 4:23 p.m. and received a response within an hour. Maya, I'd be happy to discuss your concerns. Can you meet tomorrow at 7 a.m. in the legal conference room on the 12th floor? Bring coffee. Sitting in her cubicle, Maya had felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope not. The naive kind that believed systems worked the way they were supposed to, but the harder kind that came from knowing you weren't alone in the fight. She'd pulled up Theo's USB drive and began organizing the evidence into categories: harassment documentation, deletion logs, admin access records, and witness statements. She was building a case not just against Elliot, but against the entire apparatus that had tried to erase her. The coffee maker in the break room was still broken, but Maya longer cared about the small betrayals when she was preparing to expose the large ones. The legal conference room smelled like fresh paint and ambition. Nina Bay had arrived early with 2 cups of coffee from the good machine on the executive floor and a yellow legal pad that looked like it had never been used. Maya knocked on the glass door at exactly 7 a.m. Her laptop bag heavy with USB drives and printouts that could either save her career or end it. Nina was smaller than Maya had expected, with precise movements and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She'd gestured to the chair across from her and slid one of the coffee cups forward. Thank you for meeting me, Maya had said, and I appreciate the discretion. Nina had nodded once, sharp and professional. I read your email twice last night. Workplace equity isn't just a buzzword for me, it's why I left my last firm and came to Vireon. I was told this company was committed to change. Maya had opened her laptop and pulled out the first USB drive, the one Theo had given her with the deletion logs and admin access records. What I'm about to show you might be uncomfortable. Nina had leaned forward, her expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention, as Maya walked through the timeline: Elliot's harassment, the escalating behavior, the complaint to HR, and then the systematic erasure of evidence. These are deletion logs, Maya had said, pointing to Theo's data. Your HR director has been permanently removed. Harassment complaints from the system, making them disappear, as if they never existed. Nina had studied the timestamps, her jaw tightening. This shows administrative access at 2:17 a.m., 3 days after your complaint was filed, and these files. She'd scrolled through the list. These are all your documents, not just mine, Maya had said. She'd pulled up Theo's broader report: 3 other women, same pattern, same late-night deletions, same administrative access. This isn't about one complaint, Nina, this is about a system. Nina had sat back in her chair and Maya had watched her face change from concern to something harder, something that looked like recognition. Maya, can you give me 24 hours to review this independently? I need to verify these logs against our legal compliance database and check something else. What else? Nina had hesitated, then seemed to make a decision when I was hired. 6 months ago, I was told to conduct a routine audit of HR practices for compliance purposes. I found some irregularities in complaint handling, but I was told they were legacy issues from the previous system. Maya had felt her pulse quicken. What kind of irregularities? Missing documentation. Nina had said inconsistent follow-up procedures and a concerning pattern of complaint withdrawals. Voluntary withdrawals according to the files. But the timing was always right. After employees had initial meetings with HR that evening, Maya had gone home and found herself pacing her apartment. She'd trusted Nina with everything, the evidence that could destroy Elliot and Simon, but also evidence that could destroy her if it fell into the wrong hands. She'd made copies of everything but still felt exposed, vulnerable. Like walking through a minefield while juggling dynamite. The call came at 9:30 p.m. Nina's voice was tight, controlled. Maya, we need to talk, but not at the office. Can you meet me tomorrow, at the Starbucks on Pine Street? 7 a.m. The coffee shop was crowded with morning commuters and Nina had chosen a table in the back corner away from foot traffic. She'd looked like she hadn't slept. Her legal pad was covered with notes and cross-references. I spent all night in the legal database, Nina had said, and what I found is worse than either of us imagined. She'd pulled out a folder thick with printouts. Your deletion logs match up with 17 other cases over the past 3 years. All harassment complaints. All filed by women. All permanently erased from the system. After initial HR meetings, Maya had felt the room tilt. 17 other women. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But here's what's really damning, Nina had continued. I found Simon's personnel file. He's done this before at 2 previous companies, both settled out of court, both sealed agreements. One company paid $4.7 million in damages. How did you find sealed settlements? Nina had smiled grimly. Public interest law teaches you where to look. Corporate filings, SEC documents, insurance claims. They're always breadcrumbs. If you know how to follow them. She'd opened another section of the folder. I also pulled Elliot's background. 3 harassment complaints. At his previous company. All resolved through what the legal notes call alternative dispute resolution, which is corporate speak for we paid them to go away. Maya had stared at the documents, feeling something that was part vindication, part horror. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, carefully constructed system for silencing women and protecting executives. What do we do with this? Nina had leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Officially, I can't do anything yet. I'm junior counsel and this kind of allegation against the HR director needs to go through channels. But Maya, there's something else you should know. She'd pulled out one more document. I flagged your case in our legal system yesterday, marked it as requiring senior review. It's standard procedure for harassment complaints. But the interesting thing is, the flag generated an automatic notification to the board liaison. Maya had felt her stomach drop. Board liaison. Vivian Marks. She's an external consultant brought in last quarter to audit internal processes and culture. The board hired her after some shareholder concerns about workplace culture. Her notification means this is now on the radar of people above Simon's pay grade. Nina had gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. Maya, I need you to understand something. Once this goes up the chain, we can't control it anymore. This becomes bigger than just your complaint. It becomes an investigation into systemic practices, and that makes you a key witness in something that could reshape the entire company. Maya had sat there absorbing the weight of what Nina was telling her. She'd started this trying to get Elliot to stop bothering her, And now she was potentially the catalyst for exposing years of cover-ups, corporate malfeasance. What are the chances they try to destroy me before this goes public? Nina had met her eyes honestly high. But Maya, what you've documented with Theo's help. It's not just evidence anymore. It's a smoking gun, and smoking guns have a way of forcing accountability. Even when people don't want it. They'd left the coffee shop separately. Nina heading back to legal to begin the formal review process. Maya walking the long way to work, thinking about 17 other women who'd tried to speak up and been erased from the record. Wondering if their stories would finally be told, the machine would find a way to grind this truth into dust too. But as she'd walked into the Vireon building that morning, Maya had felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt dangerous, not in a reckless way but in the way that comes from having allies and evidence. And a system that was finally starting to pay attention to the right things. The coffee maker in the break room was still broken, but Maya had brought her own cup today, filled with coffee from a place that believed in fixing things that were broken. The email arrived at 6:43 a.m. on a Wednesday, buried in Maya's inbox, between a company newsletter about the new fitness center and a reminder about quarterly performance reviews. Subject line: calendar discrepancy needs immediate attention. Maya had opened it while still in her pajamas, coffee growing cold. As she read, Maya, there seems to be some confusion about your attendance at yesterday's client presentation. According to our records, you were marked absent, but the calendar shows you as required attendee. Please see me at your earliest convenience. To discuss this discrepancy and ensure accurate documentation going forward. It was signed with Simon's signature, followed by his title, HR Director, and a line about this email being part of official personnel documentation. Maya had stared at the screen, feeling ice form in her stomach because she hadn't missed any client presentation yesterday. She'd worked from home on the quarterly communication audit, the same project she'd been assigned 2 weeks ago. She'd opened her calendar application and scrolled back to Tuesday. There it was, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. client presentation. Q4 strategy, mandatory attendance marked as accepted by her, but Maya had no memory of accepting it, no memory of receiving the invitation. Panic rising, she'd called Ria. Did I miss something yesterday? A presentation that I was supposed to be at. Ria's voice had been confused. What presentation you were working on? The audit, remember we talked about it Monday. You said you were going to work from home to avoid distractions. Maya had felt the walls closing in. Someone had added the meeting to her calendar, retroactively made it look like she'd committed to being there, then marked her absent when she didn't show, creating a paper trail of irresponsibility. The meeting with Simon was scheduled for 10 a.m. Had arrived 5 minutes early to find him already waiting with a manila folder and that same sympathetic expression he'd worn during their first conversation. Maya, thank you for coming in. I wanted to discuss this attendance issue and also some broader concerns that have been brought to my attention about your recent performance. He'd opened the folder and pulled out several documents. This client presentation was marked as high priority, and your absence was noted by the marketing team. Elliot specifically mentioned that your input was needed for the communications strategy. Maya had kept voice steady. I never received an invitation to that meeting. Simon, my calendar shows it was added yesterday, but I have no record of accepting it. Simon had made a note on his legal pad. That's concerning, Maya, because according to our system you accepted the invitation last week and then failed to attend. That kind of inconsistency raises questions about reliability. He'd pulled out another document. There's also this peer feedback survey that was conducted last month. Some of your colleagues have expressed concerns about your team collaboration and communication style. Maya had felt her tighten. What colleagues? What concerns? Simon had smiled that practiced HR smile. I can't share specific names due to confidentiality, but the feedback suggests that you've become somewhat difficult to work with withdrawn, uncommunicative, resistant to feedback. She'd asked to see the survey comments. Simon had declined, stating company policy about confidential feedback. The whole conversation had felt like being cross-examined for crimes she hadn't committed with evidence she wasn't allowed to see. The pattern accelerated over the next 2 weeks. Maya would arrive at work to find herself removed from project teams. She'd been leading her access to shared drives would mysteriously fail, requiring IT tickets that took days to resolve. Meeting invitations would arrive last minute or not at all. She'd be questioned about missed communications. Ria had watched it all with growing alarm. "They're building a case against you," she'd said during one of their careful conversations in the supply closet, "creating documentation that makes you look incompetent, unreliable. They're going to use it to justify whatever they do next." Maya had started carrying a small digital recorder in her blazer pocket, set to voice activation. She'd document every interaction, every meeting, every conversation that seemed designed to trap her. The recordings were legally questionable, but they were proof that she wasn't losing her mind. The worst incident came during what Simon called a routine check-in meeting. Maya had been called to his office where she'd found not just Simon but Elliot and another woman she didn't recognize. "Maya, this is Jennifer Walsh from our employee relations consultancy. She's here to help us work through some of the communication challenges we've been experiencing." Jennifer had a clipboard and the kind of aggressively neutral expression that came from years of corporate mediation training. "Maya, we've heard that you've been feeling some tension in the workplace, and we want to make sure you have the support you need to succeed here. Can you tell us about your experience working with the marketing team?" It was a trap elegantly constructed and perfectly legal. Maya could either admit to feeling tension, which would validate their narrative about her being difficult, or she'd deny it and look dishonest in the face of Elliot's presence. She'd chosen a third option. "I've documented several instances of inappropriate workplace behavior that have made my job more challenging. I filed a formal complaint with HR and I'm waiting for that process to be completed." Elliot shifted in his seat and Jennifer had made notes while Simon's expression had hardened slightly. "Maya, we've investigated your complaint thoroughly and found no evidence of inappropriate behavior. What we have found is a pattern of professional interactions that may have been misinterpreted due to stress or other personal factors." He'd pulled out yet another document, which brings us to our recommendation. "We think you might benefit from some time away from the office to get perspective on these issues. We're prepared to offer you a voluntary leave of absence with pay while you work through whatever personal challenges might be affecting your judgment." Maya had felt the room spin. Voluntary leave was corporate speak for "we're giving you a chance to disappear quietly before we fire you for cause." "I don't need time away," she'd said. "I need the inappropriate behavior to stop and I need my work environment to return to professional standards." Jennifer had made more notes and Elliot had finally spoken. "Maya, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my mentorship style. If my efforts to help you develop professionally have been misinterpreted, I apologize, but I hope you can see that the real issue here might be your perception of normal workplace interactions." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Maya had almost doubted herself for a moment. Almost wondered if she really had misunderstood everything, but then she'd remembered the screenshots on her phone, the deletion logs from Theo. The 17 other women Nina had found. She'd stood up. "I need to think about this offer, of course," Simon had said. "But Maya, I hope you'll consider that we're trying to help you here. Refusing assistance when it's offered could be seen as unwillingness to address performance concerns." Walking back to her desk, Maya had felt like she was drowning in corporate quicksand. Every move she made seemed to sink her deeper, but as she'd sat down at her computer, she'd remembered something Nina had said about smoking guns having a way of forcing accountability. It was time to light the fuse. The Vireon Systems anonymous whistleblower hotline had been launched with great fanfare 3 months ago, part of the company's new transparency initiative designed to restore investor confidence after some bad press about workplace culture. The board had hired an external firm to manage it, complete with a slick website and promises of confidential reporting for ethical concerns. Maya had stared at the hotline webpage for 20 minutes before clicking submit. She'd uploaded everything: Theo's deletion logs, Nina's compliance research, her own documentation of harassment, retaliation. The anonymous tip form had a section for narrative summary, and Maya had written what felt like a confession: systematic harassment. by senior executive covered up by HR Director, evidence of document deletion, and complaint suppression, multiple victims over multiple years. Retaliation against employees who report concerns, senior leadership aware and complicit. She'd hit submit at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night and immediately felt like she'd jumped off a cliff without checking if there was water below. The response came faster than anyone expected. The whistleblower hotline was managed by Meridian Compliance Group, an external firm that reported directly to Vireon's board of directors, not to internal management. When they received Maya's submission with its detailed documentation and serious allegations of systematic cover-up, they'd triggered their emergency protocol. Vivian Marks got the call at 6:30 a.m. Saturday morning. She was Vireon's board liaison, a sharp corporate cleanup specialist who'd been brought in to audit internal processes after shareholder concerns about culture and governance. The Meridian rep had been apologetic but firm. Ms. Marks have a level 4 submission, systematic harassment. Cover up with documentation, board notification required immediately. Vivian had spent Saturday morning reviewing Maya's evidence from her home office in Bellevue, her expression growing darker with each document. The deletion logs were damning, pattern of complaint suppression was unmistakable, and the digital evidence was ironclad by noon. She'd made 3 phone calls to board members and scheduled an emergency session for Monday morning. Maya had spent the weekend in a state of controlled panic, checking her phone obsessively for indication that her anonymity had been compromised. She'd walked around Green Lake twice on Saturday trying to calm her nerves and meal prepped for a week. Like she was preparing for a siege. Monday morning brought chaos in a corporate package. Vivian had arrived at Vireon at 7 a.m., assistants and a briefcase full of legal documents. By 8:30, she'd set up a command center in the executive conference room and begun summoning people for interviews. Simon had been the first call. Simon, we need to discuss some compliance issues that have come to the board's attention. Clear your calendar for the day. His voice had been steady, but Maya could hear the tension underneath. Of course, Vivian, what kind of compliance issues? The kind that require immediate attention and full documentation. Please bring any files related to harassment, complaints. From the past 3 years, Maya had watched from her cubicle as Simon had hurried between his office and the elevator carrying banker's boxes and looking like a man who'd just realized the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Elliot had been the second summons, then Jennifer Walsh, the employee relations consultant, who'd been brought in for Maya's interrogation. By lunchtime, whispers had spread through the office like wildfire. Someone from legal was setting up a document scanning station in the conference room. People were being called for interviews. HR was in lockdown mode with Simon nowhere to be seen. Rhea had found Maya in the break room where she was pretending to eat a sandwich. Something big is happening, she'd said. Theo from IT said they're imaging hard drives and pulling backup files. Nina from legal looks like she hasn't slept, and there are rumors that Elliot called in sick today. Maya had nodded, trying to look appropriately curious while her heart hammered against her ribs. Any idea what triggered it? Rhea had shrugged. But there are theories. Someone said the whistleblower hotline got a major tip over the weekend. The kind that goes straight to the board at 2:15. Maya's phone had buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Ortiz, this is Vivian Marks, board liaison. I need to speak with you this afternoon. Are you available for a confidential conversation? Maya had stared at the message, feeling everything crystallize into sharp focus. They knew who she was, which meant either her anonymity had been compromised, or they'd put the pieces together from the evidence. Either way, there was no going back now. She'd texted back, available when needed. The response had come immediately. Conference room, 16th floor, 3 p.m. Bring any additional documentation you might have. Walking to the elevator, Maya had felt like she was approaching the edge of everything she'd known. The quiet career, the invisible competence, the safety of staying small and unremarkable. She was about to step into the kind of visibility that could destroy her, or transform her. But as the elevator doors had closed, she thought about the 17 other women, whose voices had been erased, and realized she was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all of them. The coffee maker in the break room was still broken. But Maya no longer cared about the small things. When the large things were finally beginning to change, conference room C was nothing like the sterile meeting spaces. Maya was used to this one, had real wood paneling and chairs that didn't make your back ache, and windows that looked out over Elliott Bay. Instead of the parking garage, Vivian Marks sat at the head of a mahogany table that probably cost more than Maya's annual salary. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency over fashion, and her eyes were the kind of gray that missed nothing. Maya had arrived at exactly 3 p.m., carrying a messenger bag stuffed with printed emails, USB drives, and a small digital recorder she'd been using to document every interaction for the past month. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was hammering out Morse code against her throat. "Ms. Ortiz, thank you for coming," Vivian had said, gesturing to the chair directly across from her. "Please sit wherever you're comfortable." The room wasn't empty. Nina Bay sat to Vivian's left with a laptop and a stack of legal pads. A court reporter had set up equipment in the corner, and Simon Trask occupied the chair furthest from the door, looking like a man who'd been summoned to his own execution. His usual confidence had been replaced by something that resembled controlled panic. "This is an informal testimony session," Vivian had continued, "not a legal proceeding, but everything will be recorded and documented for board review. You have the right to have counsel present if you prefer, but this is primarily an information-gathering session." Maya had glanced at Simon, who was studying his hands, like they held classified information. "I understand," she'd said. "I'm ready to proceed." Nina had opened her laptop and pulled up what looked like a comprehensive timeline. "Miss Ortiz, we've reviewed the materials submitted through Whistleblower Hotline, and we've conducted preliminary interviews with several employees. We'd like you to walk us through your experience in chronological order, starting with your first concerning interaction with Elliott Rains." Maya had taken a breath and begun speaking, her voice growing stronger. As she moved through the timeline, she'd described Elliott's escalating behavior, the inappropriate comments, the professional undermining, the late-night messages that disappeared from the system. She'd pulled out her phone and showed them screenshots, timestamps, witness accounts when she'd reached the part about filing her complaint with HR. Simon had shifted in his chair but remained silent. Vivian had made notes with a fountain pen that looked older than Maya's rear. "You filed a formal complaint on March 15th. Vivian had said, and met with Mr. Trask on March 17th. "Can you describe that meeting?" Maya had looked directly at Simon as she spoke. His face had gone pale, that he'd maintained eye contact. "He dismissed my concerns as miscommunication. She'd said he suggested Elliott was being mentored and I was misinterpreting enthusiasm. He presented me with a form for informal mediation. I would have waived my right to external filing." Nina had pulled up something on her laptop. "Ms. Ortiz, according to our review, no formal complaint was logged in the HR system on March 15th, or any date following your meeting with Mr. Trask. Can you explain this discrepancy?" This was the moment Maya had been preparing for. She'd reached into her bag and pulled out 2 USB drives. "My work documents were deleted from the system," she'd said, "but I have independent backups. These drives contain the original complaint, the deletion logs showing when files were removed, and the administrative access record showing who removed them." She'd handed the drives to Nina, who'd plugged one into her laptop. The silence in the room had been absolute, except for the soft clicking of keyboard keys. "Mr. Trask," Nina had said finally, "these logs show administrative access to backup systems at 2:17 after Ms. Ortiz filed her complaint. Can you explain why you were permanently deleting employee files in the middle of the night?" Simon had finally spoken, his voice careful and measured. I was conducting routine maintenance on legacy files that were taking up server space. There was no intent to suppress legitimate complaints. Maya had felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. Simon, she'd said, you told me my complaint had been documented, but there's no record of it anywhere. You deleted it along with 17 other harassment complaints filed by women over the past 3 years. Vivian Penn had stopped moving. She'd looked at Simon with an expression that could have frozen coffee. Mr. Trask, is this accurate? Did you delete 17 harassment complaints? Simon's composure had finally cracked slightly. Those were informal complaints that were resolved through alternative dispute resolution. The complainants agreed to have the records expunged as part of their settlement agreements, but Maya didn't agree to a settlement. Vivian had said her complaint was dismissed as frivolous and then deleted without her knowledge or consent. That's not alternative dispute resolution evidence. Tampering, the court reporter's fingers had moved steadily across her machine, capturing every word, every pause, every moment of Simon's professional destruction. Maya had watched it unfold with a mixture of vindication and horror. Nina had pulled up another document. Mr. Trask, we've all reviewed your employment history. You've held similar positions at Meridian Technologies and Synapse Corporation. Both companies paid substantial settlements for harassment claims during your tenure. Can you explain this pattern? Simon had looked around the room like he was searching for an exit. Didn't exist. Those settlements were business decisions to avoid the cost and distraction of litigation. There was no admission of wrongdoing. Vivian had closed her notebook with a snap that sounded like a gavel. Mr. Trask, you're suspended from all duties effective immediately pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your access credentials and company equipment before leaving the building today. Maya had watched Simon's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. He'd gathered his things without speaking and left the room, escorted by building security like criminal being walked when the door had closed behind him. Vivian had turned back to Maya. Ms. Ortiz, I want to apologize on behalf of Vireon's board of directors. What happened to you was unacceptable, and the systematic suppression of complaints represents a complete failure of our corp governance. Maya had felt tears threaten, but she'd kept her voice steady. What happens to Elliot? He submitted his resignation this morning. Vivian had said effective immediately. He'll receive no severance and his departure will be noted in his employment record. We're also reviewing potential legal action. Nina had leaned forward. Maya, there's something else. The Federal Department of Labor has been conducting a broader investigation into workplace harassment, cover-ups in tech companies. Your documentation and evidence could be crucial to their case. Would you be willing to testify? Maya had thought about the 17 other women whose voices had been erased, about all the future women who might file complaints, only to have them disappear into digital black holes. Yes, she'd said, I'll testify. Vivian had stood and extended her hand. Ms. Ortiz, we'd like to offer you a position in our new Compliance and Ethics Division, reporting directly to the board. We need someone who understands how these systems fail and how to build better ones. Maya had shaken her hand, feeling something shift inside her chest like a weight she'd been carrying for months. Finally lifting. I'd like to hear more about that position. As they'd left the conference room, Maya had realized that the coffee maker in the break room didn't matter anymore, because she was never going back to that cubicle in the shadow corner ever again. The email went out at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, buried in the weekly leadership update, between announcements about the new employee wellness program and reminders about upcoming quarterly reviews. Subject line: Organizational Transition. Human Resources Leadership. Effective immediately. Simon Trask has stepped down from his position as Director of Human Resources to pursue other opportunities. Jennifer Walsh will serve as Interim Director while we conduct a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. We thank Simon for his contributions to Vireon and wish him well in his future endeavors. Maya had read it 3 times sitting in the temporary office. Vivian had assigned her on the 15th floor with actual windows and a door that closed the corporate speak. Was masterful. making Simon's firing sound like a voluntary career move, rather than the result of a federal investigation into systematic harassment. Cover-ups. Rhea had knocked on her door 5 minutes after the email went out. Holy shit. Maya, she'd said, then caught herself. Sorry, I know you're probably not supposed to talk about whatever happened, but Simon Trask just got wiped from the company directory like he never existed. Maya had gestured for her to sit down and close the door. I can't discuss the details, she'd said, but Rhea, you should know that if you or anyone else has ever filed a complaint that disappeared or was dismissed without proper investigation, there are people looking into that now. Rhea's eyes had widened. You mean this goes beyond just your situation? Maya had nodded carefully. Much beyond. The riffs had started immediately. By the end of the week, 3 more women had come forward with stories of harassment complaints that had vanished into Simon's digital shredder. The legal department had set up a hotline, specifically for employees who wanted to report suppressed complaints, and Nina Ben had been promoted to lead the internal investigation. Theo had stopped by Maya's new office on Friday afternoon, looking relieved and slightly amazed. The server logs are getting a full forensic review, he'd said, and they found backups that Simon didn't know existed. 17 complaints over 3 years, all deleted, all women, all marked as resolved when they were actually just erased. Maya had felt a familiar surge of anger mixed with vindication. What about the other women? The 17, whose complaints disappeared? Some of them still work here. Theo had said quietly, and word is getting around that their stories might finally be heard. Nina's been reaching out to former employees too, building a comprehensive database of suppressed complaints. That evening, Maya had gotten a call from Vireon. Maya, I wanted to update you on Elliot's situation. His resignation is being reviewed by our legal team, and there's a strong possibility we'll pursue criminal charges for the harassment and the conspiracy to cover it up. Criminal charges. Maya had felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. The federal investigation is expanding. Vireon had continued. They're looking at Elliot's behavior at his previous companies and the pattern of settlements and NDAs. It turns out, you weren't the only one documenting inappropriate behavior. Maya had thought about all the screenshots on her phone, all the careful notes she'd taken, all the evidence she'd gathered, not knowing she was building a case that would extend far beyond Vireon. There's something else, Vireon had said. The board wants to make a public statement about our commitment to workplace safety and accountability. We'd like you to be part of that statement. You're comfortable? Maya had considered this, the idea of her story becoming public, of being the face of systematic change, rather than just another silenced victim. What would that involve? A press conference announcing our new harassment prevention policies and the appointment of you as our director of workplace ethics. Your story would be part of that announcement, but only with your full consent and only the details you're comfortable sharing. Maya had hung up and spent the weekend thinking about visibility, about stepping out of the shadows she'd inhabited for her entire career, about becoming the kind of person who testified at congressional hearings instead of hiding in supply closets. Monday morning had brought news that changed everything. Elliot Rains had been arrested at his home in Bellevue on charges of criminal harassment and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The news had broken on local television before it reached the company email system. Maya had watched the coverage from her office. Elliot in handcuffs, being led to a police car. His expensive suit wrinkled his carefully maintained image. Finally cracking, the reporter had mentioned multiple victims across multiple companies, and an ongoing federal investigation into corporate harassment. Cover-ups. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Nina. Saw the news, how are you holding up? Maya had typed back, better than I expected, ready to work, because that's what this had become. Not just her personal vindication, but work, real work, the kind that might prevent other women from spending months documenting abuse, only to watch it disappear into digital black holes. The announcement about her new position had gone out that afternoon. Director of Workplace Ethics, reporting directly to the board, charged with rebuilding Vireon harassment prevention systems and ensuring that complaints were investigated properly, documented, transparently, and resolved fairly. Rhea had been the first to congratulate her. "You know, Maya," she'd said, "this whole thing started because you refused to disappear quietly. Elliot and Simon probably thought you'd just quit and go away like all the others." Maya had looked out her window at the city beyond the glass, at all the other office buildings filled with people trying to navigate systems that weren't designed to protect them. "They were wrong," she'd said. "I'm not going anywhere." That afternoon, Maya had gotten an email from someone she didn't recognize. Subject line: "Thank you, Ms. Ortiz. My name is Jennifer Chen. I worked at Vireon 3 years ago and filed a harassment complaint that was dismissed by Simon Trask. I quit shortly after because I couldn't handle the retaliation, but I saw news about the investigation, and I wanted you to know that what you did matters. There are more of us than you know, and we're ready to tell our stories now." Maya had printed the email and put it in the folder she was building for the federal testimony she'd agreed to give next month. It was getting thick, that folder full of voices that had been silenced, but were finally beginning to speak. The coffee maker in the break room had been fixed. Maya had noticed it that morning when she'd walked past on her way to a meeting about implementing new harassment prevention training, but she'd kept walking toward the executive elevator that would take her to the boardroom where real decisions were made, because some things, once broken, needed to be completely rebuilt. The call came at 8:23 a.m. On a Thursday. Maya had been reviewing compliance reports for the new harassment prevention system when her direct line rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. "Ms. Ortiz, this is Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General. I'm calling regarding your testimony in the Vireon Systems investigation." Maya had set down her coffee cup carefully. "Yes, I'm scheduled to testify next month. Ms. Torres, I'm calling because the scope of our investigation has expanded significantly and we'd like to discuss additional testimony that goes beyond the Vireon case. Are you available to meet this week?" Maya had felt her pulse quicken. "Additional testimony meaning what exactly?" "We've identified a pattern of harassment cover-ups across multiple technology companies involving some of the same individuals who worked at Vireon. Your documentation and experience could be crucial to a much larger case." The meeting had been scheduled for Friday at the federal building downtown. Maya had taken the morning off and dressed in her most serious suit, the one she'd bought for job interviews, but had never needed until now. The federal building was all marble and metal detectors, and people who looked like they'd never worked in cubicles. Agent Torres met her in a conference room that made Vireon's executive spaces look shabby by comparison. She was younger than Maya had expected, with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of investigating corporate malfeasance. "Ms. Ortiz, thank you for coming. We've reviewed your materials extensively, and they've helped us identify patterns that extend well beyond what happened at Vireon." She'd opened a thick folder and spread out documents across the table. "Elliot Raines has worked at 6 companies over the past 12 years, Agent Torres had said, "and we've found evidence of harassment complaint at 5 of them, all handled by HR directors who've subsequently moved to other companies where similar patterns emerge." Maya had studied the organizational charts and employment timelines. It was like looking at a migration pattern: predators moving from company to company, protected by administrators who specialized in making problems disappear. "Simon Trask isn't unique," Agent Torres had continued. "He's part of a network of HR professionals who've built careers on protecting executives and silencing complainants. They move between companies, sharing best practices for complaint suppression, evidence destruction." Maya had felt something cold settle in her stomach. "This is organized, more organized than most people realize," Agent Torres had said. "We've identified at least 40 companies where these individuals have worked and hundreds of suppressed harassment complaints. The finance settlements alone total over $200 million. She'd pulled out another document. "But here's what makes your case special, Maya. You documented everything. You kept records outside the corporate system, and you had allies who helped you preserve evidence that was supposed to disappear. Harassment cases die in isolation, but yours survived, and that survival has opened doors to investigations we couldn't have pursued otherwise. Maya had thought about Theo with his USB drives and late-night server access, about Nina's quiet legal research, about Ria's warnings and support. I had helped, she'd said. Good people who believed that systems should work the way they're supposed to. Agent Torres had nodded. That's exactly why we need your testimony, Ms. Ortiz. In 3 weeks, we're announcing a comprehensive investigation into corporate harassment cover-ups involving 12 major companies, and we're seeking federal legislation that would criminalize the systematic suppression of workplace harassment complaints. Maya had felt the room tilt slightly. Federal legislation. Your case study will be one of 5 that we present to Congress as evidence for why current corporate self-regulation is insufficient and why federal oversight is necessary. Maya had thought about the 17 women whose voices had been erased, about Jennifer Chen and the others who were finally ready to tell their stories, about all the future women who might file complaints, only to watch them disappear. This testimony involved public hearings, Agent Torres had said, congressional committees, media coverage. Your story would become part of the public record and part of the legal foundation for new federal protections. Maya had sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what was being offered, the chance to transform her experience from personal trauma into systemic change. There's something else, Agent Torres had said. We'd like to offer you a consulting position with our investigation team, helping us identify patterns in other companies and developing best practices for harassment prevention and complaint handling. Maya had thought about her new position at Vireon, about the work she was doing to rebuild their systems from the ground up. I'd need to discuss this with my current employer, of course, but Maya, this investigation could take 2 years, and the legislation proposing could reshape workplace protections for millions of employees. Your experience isn't just evidence anymore, it's a blueprint for change. Walking back to her car, Maya had felt like she was carrying something larger than herself, the weight of responsibility, but also the lightness that came from knowing her voice would finally be heard, not just by a boardroom of executives trying to manage crisis, but by lawmakers who could create real change. That afternoon, she'd called Vivian and explained the situation. Maya, Vivian had said without hesitation, you have Vireon's full support for this testimony, and if you decide to take the consulting position, we'll work out an arrangement that allows you to do both. Your work here is important, but this federal investigation could prevent what happened to you from happening to thousands of other women. Maya had hung up and looked out her off window at the city beyond, thinking about all the other conference rooms where women were being told their complaints were misunderstandings, all the other HR directors who were deleting evidence, all the other executives who believed they were untouchable. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Nina. Saw the news about the federal investigation. Proud of you for doing this. Maya had typed back, just getting started, because that's what this felt like. Not an ending, but a beginning. The transformation from victim to advocate, from silence to testimony, from surviving a broken system to building better ones. The coffee maker in the break room was working perfectly now, but Maya had her own coffee machine in her office, and her own budget for hiring people who understood that some problems were too important to ignore. Next week she would start preparing for congressional testimony, and the week after that she would begin consulting on the largest investigation into corporate harassment cover-ups in federal history. But today she had work to do, reviewing policies and interviewing candidates for the new ombudsman position, and making sure that the next woman who walked into Vireon with a complaint would find a system designed to listen rather than silence. Some days the work of changing the world looked exactly like sitting at a desk and rewriting employee handbooks, but it was still changing the world. The Hart Senate office building was nothing like the corporate conference rooms. Maya had grown accustomed to this was democracy and marble and mahogany with ceiling frescoes that had witnessed decades of testimony that changed the course of history. The committee room buzzed with the controlled chaos of federal hearings, reporters adjusting cameras, staffers distributing documents, senators reviewing notes like they were preparing for final exams. Maya sat at the witness table, wearing the navy blue suit. Vivian had helped her select for this moment. Her hands were steady. Now, after months of preparation, but her heart still hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape, she'd testified in depositions, given interviews to federal investigators, but this was different. This was public record, permanent, and streamed live to anyone who cared about the intersection of corporate power and workplace justice. Senator Patricia Williamson, the committee chair, had called the hearing to order with a gravity that made the room settle into focused attention. The purpose of today's hearing, she'd announced, is to examine systematic patterns of workplace harassment, cover-ups in corporate America, and to consider federal legislation that would criminalize the suppression of harassment complaints. We'll hear from 5 witnesses whose experiences illustrate the urgent need for federal intervention. Maya had been the third witness after a labor economist who'd presented statistics about harassment, underreporting, and a former corporate attorney who detailed the legal loopholes that enabled cover-ups. When her name was called, she'd walked to the microphone, feeling like she was stepping into a spotlight that would never quite turn off. Ms. Ortiz, Senator Williamson had said, "You filed a harassment complaint at Vireon Systems that was subsequently deleted from company records along with complaints from 17 other women. Can you tell us about that experience?" Maya had leaned into the microphone and begun speaking, her voice clear and measured. She'd told the story, chronologically: Elliot's escalating behavior, Simon's dismissal and erasure of her complaint, the systematic deletion of evidence, the retaliation campaign designed to make her disappear. But what made her testimony different from the sterile corporate depositions was the context she'd provided. "Senator, I want to be clear about something," she'd said. "This wasn't just about one man's inappropriate behavior, or even one company's failure to respond properly. This was about a system designed to protect executives at the expense of employees, a system where HR directors build careers on making problems disappear rather than solving them." She'd pulled out a document that had become her calling card over the past 6 months. The federal investigation has identified 40 companies where similar patterns exist. Hundreds of women whose complaints were deleted, suppressed, or buried in confidential settlements. We're not talking about isolated incidents. We're talking about an industry standard. Senator James Morrison, a Republican from Texas, had leaned forward. "Ms. Ortiz, while your experience was clearly unacceptable, don't you think federal regulation might be an overreach? Shouldn't companies be allowed to handle these matters internally?" Maya had been preparing for this question for weeks. "Senator, with respect, internal handling is exactly the problem. Companies investigate themselves. They have every incentive to minimize liability and protect valuable executives rather than protect employees. The system I experienced wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed." She'd gestured to the gallery where other women who'd testified in federal depositions were sitting. "The women behind me represent just a fraction of the cases we've documented, but Senator, every single one of them followed proper procedures, filed complaints through official channels, trusted the system to work, and every single one of them was told their concerns, misunderstandings, or miscommunications, while evidence was systematically destroyed." Senator Williamson had nodded, taking notes. "Ms. Ortiz, you've since worked with both Vireon and the Department of Labor to develop new harassment prevention systems. What would federal legislation look like in practice?" So it was the moment Maya had been building toward for months, the chance to transform her experience into actionable policy. Federal legislation should establish 3 key requirements. Maya had said: first, mandatory preservation of all harassment complaints and related documentation with criminal penalties for evidence destruction. Second, independent oversight of company harassment investigations through federal monitors. Third, standardized reporting requirements, so patterns can be identified across companies and industries. She'd paused, looking directly at the cameras that were broadcast this hearing to newsrooms and office break rooms across the country. "But Senator, the most important thing federal legislation could do is eliminate the corporate immunity that currently exists when companies systematically suppress harassment complaints. Right now there are no meaningful consequences for the kind of cover-up I experienced, and that's why it continues." Senator Morrison had pressed further, but Ms. Ortiz, wouldn't these requirements be burdensome for businesses, particularly smaller companies? Maya had felt something sharp and focused rise in her chest. Senator, the current system burdensome for the women who spend months documenting abuse only to watch their complaints disappear. It's burdensome for the employees who quit good jobs because they can't get protection from harassment. It's burdensome for the shareholders who ultimately pay the settlements when these cases finally surface. She'd leaned closer to the microphone. The cost of prevention is always lower than the cost of cover-up, both financially and morally. The hearing had continued for 3 hours with expert testimony about implementation costs and constitutional considerations. But Maya's words had been the ones that made headlines that evening. Corporate harassment cover-up criminalized in proposed federal legislation. Former tech employee becomes voice for workplace reform. Vireon whistleblower testifies. Congress must act on systematic harassment suppression. 6 months after the hearing, the Workplace Harassment Accountability Act had passed both houses of Congress and been signed into law by a president who'd made workplace equity a cornerstone of her administration. Maya had been invited to the signing ceremony, where she'd stood in the Rose Garden watching her experience become federal policy. But the real change had been quieter and more personal. Maya's consulting work with the Department of Labor had expanded into a permanent position as Director of Workplace Compliance Enforcement. She'd hired Nina Bay as her deputy and Theo Jenkins as their chief technology officer, tasked with developing systems that preserved rather than destroyed evidence. On a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 18 months after she'd first filed her complaint against Elliot Rains, Maya had walked into a conference room at the Department of Labor to review the latest compliance reports from companies across the country. Harassment complaints were up 40%, but that was progress. It meant people were reporting instead of suffering in silence. Raya had joined her team 6 months earlier, bringing her talent for cutting through corporate doublespeak to help draft enforcement guidelines. Raya had said during one of their strategy meetings, "The thing that still amazes me is how it all started with you just refusing to disappear quietly." Maya had looked out the window at the city beyond, thinking about all the conference rooms where women were filing complaints that couldn't be deleted, all the HR directors who were learning that evidence destruction carried federal criminal penalties, all the executives who were discovering that harassment had real consequences. "I didn't refuse to disappear," she'd said. "I just refused to let them erase." There's a difference. Her phone had buzzed with an email from someone she didn't recognize. Subject line: "Thank you for speaking up, Ms. Ortiz. My name is Sarah Kim. I work at a tech company in Austin. Last month I filed a harassment complaint, and because of the new federal requirements it was investigated properly and resolved fairly. My harasser was terminated and I kept my job. I wanted you to know that the law you helped create is working. It's saving careers and maybe lives." Maya had printed the email and added it to the thick folder she kept of messages from women whose complaints had been heard instead of silenced. The folder was getting heavy, but that was good weight. The weight of voices that mattered. The weight of change that lasted. That evening, Maya had given a presentation to a group of HR professionals about implementing the new federal requirements. It was the kind of work she'd never imagined doing, standing in front of executives explaining why their old systems had failed and how to build better ones. During the Q&A session, someone had asked Ms. Ortiz, "Do you ever regret speaking up considering everything you went through?" Maya had thought about the cubicle in the shadows, the corner, about the coffee maker that never worked, about the months of documentation and fear and isolation, about all the moments when disappearing quietly would have been easier. "No," she'd said. "I regret that it took so long for me to speak up, and I regret that so many other women had to suffer in silence while systems were designed to erase them. But I don't regret fighting back, because that's what this had become, not just her personal vindication, but a blueprint for fighting back against systems designed to silence inconvenient truths." The coffee maker in her office worked perfectly now. She had a team of people whose job it was to make sure that other women's voices wouldn't disappear into digital black holes. Some victories looked like headlines and federal legislation, but the best ones looked like emails from strangers saying thank you for making it possible to be heard. Record would reflect that Maya Ortiz had refused to be erased, and in refusing had helped ensure that millions of other women wouldn't be erased either. That was legacy, that was change, that was the complaint they'd tried to bury becoming the law that would protect everyone who came after up. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from